PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi.
Hello, my name is Svitlana and welcome to round 12 of the Women's Candidates. We are nearing the end of the tournament where the most exciting games usually happen. Today, I want to show you a very creative game between Muzychuk and Vaishali Rameshbabu that involved an exchange sacrifice and a long positional battle. Muzychuk plays as white here and she starts with e4, Vaishali goes e5. Out of the opening, we see a very classic Ruy Lopez. We see this opening a lot at high level, which means that the theory here is quite advanced, and we are going to see it in this game as well. Vaishali chooses the line with knight f6, and after castles, she takes on e4, going for a rather aggressive line. What Vaishali usually played here earlier was b5, and after bishop b3, bishop e7, leading to very standard Ruy Lopez theory. But she goes for something different with knight to e4, still a line that exists, just not as popular as the b5 line. Normally, we do need to be careful about taking such pawns because the black king is still in the center, so while it's still not castled, we do need to be a bit cautious about opening up the center. But this seemed to be Vaishali's preparation, while Anna was taken slightly off guard and started to think a little bit here. Still, she remembered the best continuation with d4. Now we see bishop e7 played by black quite quickly as well. This line exists once again, but is not the main line. The more popular option would be to go for b5 once again, and then d5 for black. And after something like this, things get more closed in the center, and the game goes on. But in our game, we saw bishop to e7. Played very quickly. Now rook to e1 follows, of course going on to that semi-open file. And now black goes b5. So here we see that the knight is hanging, so things are starting to get a bit more tactical. This is a line that has been played before at the top level, and this line is rather forced. It leads to a pretty big number of draws, but things were not as peaceful in our game. So the knight is hanging, white takes it, and now black doesn't take it back immediately, because if they do take the piece back, there's this d5 move by white, leads to a very good position for white, more space, more active pieces. This is not what black wants out of the opening. So instead, they counterattack the rook with d5. Vaishali is still in theory at this point, plays this instantly. Now both of white's pieces are hanging. So it's funny that even though both of these are hanging, white also goes for a counterattack with knight takes e5. This is all theory, but seeing it for the first time can be a bit surprising. Now black cannot really take the rook because of knight to c6. And if we look at this position, it's two pieces against the rook. The two pieces are way stronger in this type of middle game. So instead the knight takes on e5, rook takes on e5. Anna also plays these moves quickly, probably remembers this, plus the moves are rather forced. Maybe this is also just common knowledge at the grandmaster level for people who play this line. So Vaishali now takes the bishop. Finally, we get here. The position has calmed down. We have equal material. Black has a bishop pair, but also a messed up pawn structure. So there's still a lot of play left, and some advantages and some disadvantages for both colors. From this moment on, Muzychuk seemed out of theory, and she came up with the move f4. This still follows the main line, even though she did think about this and didn't seem to have looked at it this far. But Vaishali still keeps blitzing out moves with 1 hour and 33 minutes on her clock, still playing instantly to all of white's replies, and she goes a pretty wild move, king to f8. The computer approves it, so she probably knew this type of move. It looks wild at first, but it makes sense, because you don't want this king to stay on this open file forever, but you also cannot really castle, because then f5 is going to just win the piece for white. So king to f8 is kind of the best of both worlds. You remove the king from that open file, but then you also keep the bishop protected. Now if white plays f5, it doesn't have the same effect. White can take this pawn on d5, but then after a few moves, the rook gets kicked out of there, and black regains the pawn with bishop f5, and a very, very good position for black. So instead of this, Anna goes knight to c3, a logical developing move, targeting the d5 pawn, targeting the a4 pawn. The knight is placed well there. We are nearing a very important moment now, because after bishop to d6, white needs to decide what to do with the rook. Remember that Vaishali is still deep in her preparation, plays this instantly, and it can be hard to play against such a player when you know that they have looked at this before, but you have to make these difficult decisions on your own. We can think about where the rook could go, but it doesn't actually have that many options. For example, if the rook goes to e3, there's the f4 pawn hanging, and if it goes to h5, after something like queen to d7, the rook doesn't really feel that comfortable. It doesn't have a lot of squares here, doesn't attack much, and it might risk getting trapped in the future. So instead of moving away the rook, Anna plays really courageously here and sacrifices this rook for the bishop. And this ends up being a pretty good positional decision. She takes knight to a4, and after bishop e5, f takes e5. I don't know which side you would rather play for. Objectively, it's equal, as always. I think it's a very interesting position with a knight and a pawn for a rook. I think moves-wise, it is easier to play for white just because of the extra space and the potential of the minor pieces. But psychologically, it is a lot easier to play for black because of the extra exchange, first of all, and secondly, because of the 30-minute time advantage that black got out of the opening here, which does end up being significant. The position still remains very complex, and I'm very amazed that Vaishali was still blitzing this. She plays queen to h4 instantly, best move. Either she knew this once again or just was thinking on her opponent's time. Queen to h4 attacks the pawn, the bishop has to defend it, and now she offers a trade of queens with queen to g4. There's nothing particularly wrong with the trade, but when you're down material, even if it's not much, like in this situation, it is just more pleasant to play this endgame with black when you have a rook. So Anna avoids the trade, which is a very human decision. Now h5, also a nice move, making some threats on the king side now. So white decides to protect against it by playing h3. Now the queen moves away, and I feel like finally at this point the preparation was over for black. She starts playing more on her own, but still, Vaishali certainly won the opening battle with a lot of extra time, with a pretty good position up in exchange, although it's objectively equal. But still, there's a whole rest of the game left to play. White here goes h4. This is a bit weakening, but I guess the idea is to prevent black from playing h4 themselves, and also, of course, to protect this pawn from being taken by the bishop. So there is a point to it. It's just maybe it was a little bit less weakening to simply move away the king with that same idea of protecting the pawn. So h4 happened in the game, and black goes for king to g8, a pretty funny king maneuver, all the way to h7. So here the pawn was attacked, so we defended it. But king to h7, now the rooks are connected. A strange way to castle, but still a funny one. Knight goes to c5. We're getting deeper into this middle game, and the more I look at it, the more I realize that it is a bit hard for white to play. The bishop is stuck behind the pawn chain, and white doesn't have that many serious targets that they are attacking so far. Meanwhile, black, with their last move, was just preparing some f6 pawn break and trying to open up the files. So this is exactly what black does. f6, opening up the position would be advantageous for black because they have the two rooks that can occupy these open files, double up, and it's going to be harder for white. Yeah, so far white's pieces have not gone for any sort of attack onto the black king or any other pieces, so it is a bit hard to play for white. And she plays a very human move. She plays e6, aiming to keep the position closed and keep all of the files closed for the rooks to not be active. But apparently it was better to keep the pawn structure as it is and play something like a4, take back with the pawn, and play this position on, and then maybe decide to push the pawn when the time is right. But as I said, it's actually kind of difficult for white to understand why exactly this is so much better. But that's just the nature of this position. She's down in exchange, but you need to just keep it very solid for white for now. They don't have any attacking prospects. But she goes e6, which, as I've said, makes a lot of sense. Rook to e8. Now we shouldn't exchange our strong pawn for this pawn on c7, because after this, black is just going to play bishop g4, rook e2. Doesn't look that good for white anymore after trading these pawns, so she keeps the pawns together with rook to e1. Black goes rook e7, protecting that pawn. And the tough part about this position for white is that the best options here are just to hold. Just play rook e3, shuffle around with the queen, maybe extend on the queenside pawns, but that's about it. You cannot really push your pawns any more than this. So this was the best way for white to play, but Anna goes for c4, so she does want to make this pawn worth something, and she sacrifices a pawn to get the second pawn to join it with d5. The idea is, of course, d6, and to get that bishop there and push the pawn even further. Vaishali also doesn't play perfectly. She makes a few inaccuracy with bishop to d3. And after d6, bishop d6, and e7, things are finally looking promising for white, for the first time in the game, I would say. So now, black still needs to keep this blockade on the light squares for that pawn to never promote. But the problem is that if white's pawn doesn't work out, if ever this pawn gets lost, then white is definitely not going to have enough to hold here, given that they would be down 2 pawns. So white needs to be extra careful here as well. Queen goes to g4, and this was I would say, the last chance that this knight had to get to its ideal square. So white should have played knight to e6, and then we can't play knight to c7 immediately because there's queen to d4, but we do just make a waiting move like rook e3 and then knight to c7. Most likely black just has to sacrifice their exchange back. Something like this would lead to an equal position, opposite colored bishops. Both kings are weak. There might be a perpetual somewhere, but still remains very complicated. This was probably white's best chance to get this knight on c7 as quickly as possible, because that's the main plan of this position, is to make this pawn on e7 promote, and we have to do it with the knight to c7. Instead, she goes queen to f2, so maybe just protecting against those checks in a different way, the queen d4 check. Now the problem is that the knight cannot help this pawn with that same maneuver to e6, so it gets a bit more difficult to do that same thing. So she still tries it. She plays rook to f1 and rook to e1. The position starts slowly slipping away from white here. It's very hard to understand exactly why this one move is so much worse than, let's say, a queen d2 type of move from white. But the problem is that this exact same idea with the knight comes just a little bit too late. Now rook to c8, she goes knight e6, which is the correct plan. Now the whole difference is that black's bishop is not on d3 anymore, but it is on g6, which ends up being an advantage, because it is protecting that rook on e8. So this is what happened in the game, except Anna doesn't play knight c7 next. But if she did, The problem with this line is that black can now take on d6 and the rook is protected. So that whole little subtlety of that bishop being on g6 now makes this whole line not work. So white has to find a different alternative to keep that threat, and she plays queen to f4, offering a trade of queens, not something that she particularly wants to do, but needed to protect that bishop on d6. King to g8, a pretty smart move by Vaishali. That was the one piece that wasn't doing its best, was the king. So the king wants to be closer to the pawn just to protect it in case of the endgame. Finally, knight to c7 comes. The knight reaches the destination, but the timing is not ideal after black's pieces have consolidated a bit more. Now black has a very important decision, a very important move coming up. So I want you to try and find it yourself. You can pause the video if you want to give it a try. I'll drink my tea while we do that. And let's see the variations. So there's two winning moves here for black. If you found either one of them, that's already good news. So one of these moves is queen to f4, simply going for this endgame, but there is one more detail here. If you chose for this line, black has to play rook b8 here. This is the only winning move. Because after the promotion, we have rook to b2, and this pawn is just way too strong, which is going to give black a much better endgame, in fact a winning endgame. A very natural move instead, like rook c8, actually doesn't work because of a pretty amazing resource, e8, bishop takes, and now knight to d5. I mean, it's pretty hard to see, but once you look at it, there's actually no way for black to prevent this fork on e7, so black is going to lose the exchange, and the position is going to be equal for the endgame. So if you choose queen to f4, it has to be followed up with rook to b8 to have a winning endgame for black. If instead you choose something like rook to c7, basically all of these endgames with the opposite colored bishops and the rooks are going to be drawn. Well, I don't want to say drawn, but equal, just with very high drawing tendencies. The move that Vaishali played in the game was pretty amazing. It's probably my favorite out of all of them. I don't know if some of you found it. It is rook to e7. Pretty amazing move. The rook is under so many attacks, but if, let's say, the bishop takes it, then the queen is hanging. So that's not possible. If queen to g4, then there's an intermediate move, rook to e1. Pretty amazing as well. This line, of course, wins for black with so much material. So white actually has no choice but to take back the rook. And after queen to d1, queen to d6, we are now simplifying the position for black a bit more. It looks strange that black gave up their exchange, but it was a pretty important pawn that they gave it up for. And at the end of this line, remember that black is still up a pawn, so that is pretty significant for this endgame. And it is these simplifications that actually make our players reach move 40. So now they're more relaxed and can actually calculate this endgame, but it's still not over. There's a very important moment now after knight to e8. There's only one winning continuation for black now. Everything else would lead to a draw. So you can try to find it yourself once again. What do you play for black? Just a bit more calculation left in this case. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what is white's threat? And it is, of course, the rook, but also this pawn on g7. So that makes a difference. If we move the rook anywhere, then definitely this is going to be a draw after in the rook endgame. Black is just not going to have enough pawns or king activity to actually get this to a win. Bishop to e8 might seem like the most natural move, with an extra pawn in the rook endgame for black. But rook endgames have, once again, very high drawing tendencies, and one pawn in such a case would not be enough because black cannot really defend them all. White has, I don't know, if you start defending this pawn, then you have to worry about this pawn as well. So this type of position, still, of course, black can push, but it will most likely end in a draw. So bishop e8 is not it, but there's an amazing move now, king to f8. Good job if you found it. This was the move that I would say won Vaishali the game. The idea behind this king f8 move, first of all, is that now white cannot take on g7 anymore because there's bishop takes on e8. So white is forced to go for a rook trade because both of these are attacked and you can't just move one of them casually. So knight to d6, king takes on e7, and now knight to c4. Seems like white has regained the pawn, but all of this doesn't work because of bishop to f7. So that was important to see in combination with king f8. The idea behind it is that we are now in a knight versus bishop type of endgame instead of a rook endgame, and that makes a huge difference for the side that has the extra pawn. White knight is attacked, and also this pawn right behind it. It cannot be defended with b3 because of this pawn endgame that is going to be winning for black because the king is just so active and the white king doesn't have enough time to pick up all of the pawns on the king side. So there's a deep calculation involved here and a lot of understanding of endgames. So how is this endgame so different from the rook endgame? Well, we have, first of all, an imbalance here. The knight for bishop. The bishop is stronger than a knight, as a general rule, when the play is on two sides of the board, which is exactly the case here. Also, the extra pawn. Of course, black has the extra pawn, so that ends up being important here. And black has a more active king. So this king right here can actually make it to the b2 pawn a lot faster than the white king can. So it's a combination of these three factors of extra pawn, bishop being slightly more superior, and more active king that makes this position winning. But it took a lot of courage, I'm sure, to calculate this and to make sure that it was actually winning. And even though it doesn't look so simple at the start, she actually just does it flawlessly without too many problems. Knight to f5 is probably the last trick left in the position, but after king e5, there's this nice bishop f7. The knight is just trapped here on g7. So white could not have taken that pawn, but it was a nice trap to introduce here for black. Instead, king to f4 happened, and the pawn on b2 is just actually going to be the reason that white loses this game. Everything is going good on the king side because the white king and the white knight are more active. But the issue of the knight in these types of positions is that it cannot switch sides as quickly as the bishop can. So our bishop can stand on this side of the board, but be protecting this side of the board as well, while the knight cannot do that. And because it took that pawn, it has not enough time to get to the queen side and protect against black's passer. Now, okay, we need to be careful to not play bishop b1 here because there's knight to f5, but she goes bishop to g8, which is the correct way to defend against that pawn. And as we saw, the bishop just switched sides in one move, while the knight has to struggle a lot to get to that pawn, and there's simply no way for the knight to get there in time. She tried the last idea with knight to f6. And even though white's pawn was so close here on h7, it wasn't enough. King to b3, a very precise move, just protecting that promotion square and not allowing the knight to defend this pawn in any way. The king tries to join, but queen to b1 just wins that pawn and wins the game for black. So I would say it was a very creative and imbalanced game. Vaishali had great preparation that a lot of us can learn from, but I really do feel bad for Muzychuk because she didn't particularly play badly, but the preparation, the time, and just the nature of the position where she was down in exchange really played a big role here, just a combination of these three. Vaishali did do a great job though, gradually outplaying her opponent in the middle game and converting it pretty flawlessly with that rook to e7 tactic and that king to f8. Two very key moves that really won the game here. The other results of this round were all draws. Particularly one draw between Tan Zhongyi and Nurgül Salimova was a crazy game that once again pretty much almost decides the tournament. It was a miraculous save from Zhongyi while Salimova was completely winning the whole game, so it's also an interesting game to check out. Based on the standings, it is now fairly certain that one of the Chinese players will win the candidates, but we will have to stay tuned to see which one it is going to be. That is all from me today. I will be away for the next few days. I am going to visit the candidates in person for the weekend because I live in Canada myself and it is pretty close. I will see if I can make a last round recap when I am back. But overall, I'm really excited to see the action for the next few rounds and enjoyed doing these recaps with you. Bye bye.